Let's build a chapel. Hey everybody, it's Greg. If you haven't seen the challenge video where I challenged John how to build a chapel, you should watch that first. I'll put a link down below. Once you're done watching that, come on back, because I'm going to show you how I built this incredible piece of Dungeons and Dragons terrain. Let's do it. Okay, the first thing I did was to map out my chapel. So I grabbed some dollar store foam and I began to cut out the base for my structure and all the different pieces that would make up the chapel. When you're using dollar store foam, it is very important to have a very sharp utility knife. If you don't have a sharp utility knife, this happens. And of course, I am a little stupid and I do not learn from my mistakes. I thought, oh, maybe it's just my cutting skill, so I tried it again. And of course, this is what happens. Okay. First of all, I did it again. Second of all, I cut the damn ruler. Really? So I grabbed some new foam and I changed the blade on my knife, and I also used a metal ruler, which helps a lot, so I won't cut the ruler again. And it turned out pretty cool. Once I had my walls and my base structure, I wanted to texture everything with a nice stone texture. So I peeled off the paper and I'm using this cool roller that I found. It's called a block roller. You can see the texture, it just looks like awesome stone. So what I like to do is take a ruler and use it as a guide so I get a perfect line on my wall. And I like to also use a glove, because when you're doing dollar store foam like this, you really need to push it hard and it kind of hurts my hand. So I wear a glove. But as you can see here, once you get all the way through, you can see the texture is just incredible. Look at that. Look at that texture. And so I did the bottom of the wall as well, just to make sure I had a complete wall. And the nice thing about these rollers is they're modular, so you can make as high of a wall as you can. It's a little different when you're using clay like I did on my farmhouse video. But when you're using dollar store foam, you really need to push hard, and you can do as big of a wall as you want. I also took a little tin foil and just created a little extra texture. So once I did all the sides of my entire chapel, I had all my pieces, and I started to put everything together little by little. So here's the deal. I cut the top pieces too short because I wanted them to hang over the sides. So I wanted them to hang over the sides, so I cut them too short. So I decided to cut them again, but when I did that, I cut them too short again. So now I have 4 of these pieces that are all too short. So I'm gluing 2 of them together, and I'm going to cut it the right length. I don't know. We'll see what happens. So I cut off the sides and I made it the perfect length that I needed, and I began to glue it onto my structure. Now it fit absolutely perfectly, hanging over the sides exactly like I wanted, but it did have a little problem. This little the place where I glued it all together, I needed to get rid of that piece because it wouldn't fit flush onto the roof. So I just sliced that open, got rid of that little piece. It was annoying, but I finally got it out. So then it fit perfectly onto the roof, and everything looked really good at this point. I got the entire structure together. Now, utilizing the pieces that I messed up on the roof, I decided to use these pieces to make the little entrance to the chapel, or the foyer, the little protruding entrance that I was going to make with the door. Now I wanted to texture everything the same as the base of the chapel, so I used that same block wall roller, and I rolled everything out. And like I said before, it's so awesome when it comes together, because you can do it one on top of the other and you can do the entire wall and it just fits together perfectly. Look at this texture on this wall. It's incredible. So now that I had my little entrance, I got to work on the roof. And now the roof was I wanted to do something a little along the lines of learning from Black Magic Craft. I cut out all these strips of paper, and I wanted to make a little slated roof. I think it was a frozen food box, and I decided to start cutting them out 2 by 2 with scissors. But that was quite difficult. It actually hurt my hand a little bit, so I decided to use my little industrial paper cutter that I've had in the garage forever. And I just sliced them up little by little. And it was going great for the first few cuts, but then it got a little tough because every single slice I had to readjust the paper, and I thought I could do 3 or 4 at a time, but I really could only do maybe 2 before I had to readjust. So once it got a little too annoying, I actually went back to the scissors and just figured I'd either go 1 at a time or 2 at a time and just plow through it. And so I cut and I cut. And I kept cutting until the entire box was cut out. I needed to take a break. So later that night, when everyone was asleep, I decided to get to work on the bell tower. Sorry about the mess. And I wanted to use my little handheld wire cutter. And this turned out to be a really cool, precision little tool. And I just used it to cut out the shape of the bell tower, and then I used my knife to just make everything exactly round the way I wanted it to. Now the base of the bell tower was going to be stonework, and I needed it. The rollers actually do not work on XPS foam. You can't use the rollers on this type of foam. It just, for some reason, this American foam, it just doesn't work. You can't get deep enough into the groove, so I took my time and I carved in the stonework little by little. And it took me a long time throughout the night, but eventually I got a really nice look. As you can see here, the brickwork is really cool once it's all done. So I got to work on the top of the bell tower, and I wanted that to have the same look, so I drew all of the brickwork myself. And I decided it would be a good idea to make sure that the lines continued through into the middle of the curve on the inside, just to add a little extra detail. Now when you're dealing with XPS foam, it actually is a great idea to go through everything and score it with a razor blade or some type of X-Acto knife, just to make the lines extra deep and to make sure that the brickwork really stands out. So that's what I did. I scored all the little lines and made everything look the way I wanted it to. Now the next day, you can see they look really good. And they look so good, I decided to do the same technique on the actual chapel itself. Now this took a long time, but I actually went through the entire chapel and scored all the individual lines just to make them a little bit deeper. And after I scored all the lines, which took a long time, I took a pen and I drew in and just outlined every brick in order to separate each brick from the others. As you can see, it looks really good when it's all done, and when it gets painted up, it's going to look even better. So now I decided to start building my roof, the shingles on my roof, and little by little I decided to hot glue them onto the roof. Now the mistake I made was, as you can see, I started putting some of the shingles color side face up, which later would be a problem because the paint doesn't stick very good. I had to do a couple layers of paint. So when I did the other side, I put everything straight down. Now you can see the lines on the roof. I did those lines just to make sure that the roof was even, to make sure it was all even. So I wanted to make sure that the slats went exactly right, left, and I even needed some more, so I had to cut out more and glue on more. It's a monumental task. It took me the entire day just to build this little roof. I know there's a better way, and I'm going to look into it, but it actually turned out really cool when it was done. It looks fantastic. It looks like they actually built the bricks individually. So I took it out back the next day, and I painted a nice base coat of black paint and Mod Podge just to seal everything, and I even watered it down a little bit just to make sure it got into all the grooves and there wasn't any white showing. The other side I had to do a couple times because of the uneven. As you can see there, the colors peeking through the roof because I put the colored ones on the outside. I had to do that roof over again. But I did the bell tower, I did the roof, and as I was letting that dry, I decided to make my way in to do the door. Now what I wanted to do is I grabbed some clay and I took my wood roller and I rolled out nice little texture onto this clay and I carved out a door. And as you can see here, it just looks absolutely incredible. The texture on this wood roller is just amazing. So once I had my door, I wanted to let that dry, so I laid it flat on the ground and I let it dry, and I painted it up. I actually ended up gluing it onto the back of a piece of foam core, a little piece of dollar store foam core, just to make sure it lied flat. But then I wanted to make a stone ring around the door, a little, I don't know what you call it, a little door frame made of stone, so to speak. So I took a little XPS foam and cut out little tiny bricks to make the door frame. And the next day, sorry about the blurriness, but as you can see, I have a little frame for the door. And what I wanted to do was I base painted it black, and then I gave it an overcoat of Craft Smarts Pewter Gray. Now when I do my overcoats, when I do stone work, I like to see the black lines in between the stones. So actually here I put a little too much gray on, so I took a pencil and I actually removed some of the goop in between the grooves. I even took a dry brush and I got in there and I really got in the grooves and I really took out some of the gray paint. And as you can see, it looks really cool when you can see the little tiny black lines in between the stonework. Look at that. So now what I wanted to do was I learned this method from Black Magic Craft to pick out a few stones and make them different colors. So I used some tan, some red, some deep red. I even used some blue, and I just picked out a bunch of little random stones throughout, just to give it a little differentiation, like they almost took stones from different parts of the world to make this ring around the door. And after I was done with that, when I let it dry, I needed to do a little. Whenever you do this method, you have to give it a nice solid wash. So once it dried, I gave it a nice little wash with some black wash, which is black paint and water. And as you can see here, the wash I used was a little thin, and you can see me test it here on the paper towel. I actually tested it. I recognized it immediately that it was too thin, and I even put a little on the paper towel and decided, yeah, it's a little too thin. So I actually thickened it up and gave it a few more base coats, and when you see it later in the video, you'll see how nice it came out. Okay, so the next day I decided to paint up my chapel. I started with a watered down burnt umber, and what I was going for is I was going for limestone. And when you're doing limestone, a really nice method is to just water down a bunch of brown paint. Doesn't matter what type of brown it is, and I'm trying to get it in all of the different cracks and crevices. So make sure it's watered down and just get into all the different cracks and crevices. That you're not actually painting. You're just trying to get it in the crevices. And then you take a paper towel and you wipe it clean. You wipe the face of it off because you want that whiter exterior when you're doing limestone. You just want the brown to get into all the cracks and crevices, all the nooks and crannies, all the nice little texture that you made. And when you wipe it off, you'll see here later on how amazing it looks when you do this method. It just looks like incredible sandstone. Or limestone, sorry, limestone. So for the next coat, I'm using some raw sienna, and I put a little raw sienna in there, and I mixed it in with a little yellow. I'm using, I think it's mustard yellow, and then a lot of white. You can see here, when I mix it up, I need more white. So I decided to put some more white in there and make it even lighter, and you're going for kind of a light salmon color. And I needed even more white, so I put more white in there and I mixed it up. And then I decided it actually needs a little bit more yellow, so I took a little bit of what I just made and added some yellow. And I also added some more white to make it even more the color that I wanted. You can see here the difference. The little yellowish, whitish color at the right is the one I wanted to use. So I used that, and I gave this kind of a dry brush, maintaining the brown in between. This is more of a dry brush. You can see it's kind of a yellowish salmon white color at the end. And I did that throughout the entire thing. And once I was done with that, I just added pure white at the end. And I didn't really wipe off the brush. I just kind of brushed it off, and I kept the same brush, but I gave it a little white overcoat, so to speak, and a little heavy dry brush on the white. And you can see all the nice little textures that come in between there. And later I'm going to give it a brown wash, and that'll really bring it all together. So for the roof, I'm using Apple Barrel's Tuscan Teal. It's a really nice blue color. I think it fits with this whole scheme, and I just gave the entire roof a nice coat of this Tuscan teal. And it didn't bother me if I saw some of the black slats in between, because I think that differentiates from the actual little shingles. So as you can see, it turned out really nice, and of course when I do the wash, everything will really come together. So I started to work on the wood paneling, which would go underneath the roof. And I wanted to use that wood roller, and I tried really hard to do the wood roller onto the XPS foam, and it turned out pretty cool. But I actually took a wire brush and just decided to go through it again with the wire brush just to make individual little wood grain lines. But the deeper lines were really cool with the wood roller. So I painted those up with a nice coat of black Mod Podge, and while I was letting those dry, I got to work on the corner pieces. I used XPS foam, and I decided to make little corner pieces that I could use for the corner of the chapel. And after I glued them together, I actually carved in each individual brick line. This took a long time, but it actually worked out really cool. Kind of the same way I did the bell tower. And I just carved every little line in there. And I actually took the razor blade and I scored it as well. And once I had the corner pieces, I used some tin foil and a piece of wood. Just put them on a piece of wood. And I used tin foil to give them a little bit of extra texture. Now once I had these corner pieces, I painted them all up with black Mod Podge and let those dry as well. Now in retrospect, I actually should have base coated them in white, because I was going for a similar limestone color. I mixed up some raw sienna and some yellow and some white, and I gave it the base coat, but it didn't really turn out exactly like I wanted to. But it did turn out really cool. Actually, after I gave them the white dry brush, it just kind of looked like stonework, and I did give them a brown wash at the end. And the corner pieces actually turned out really nice, almost as if they were an afterthought. They added those later. So I didn't mind that they were actually a different color because they kind of stood out. So now I got to work on the bell tower, and this was actually a monumental task for me because this little fine-tuning work is really hard for me. So I got to work on the bell tower. I found this cute little bell at Michael's, and I wanted it to look like the bell was hanging from a little rusty rod in the middle of the bell tower. So I used a toothpick for the rod, and I painted everything up to look like a nice little rust color. So now I decided to paint the bell tower, and in retrospect this would have been a good idea to do this before I glued it onto the chapel, but hey, you learn from your mistakes. So I did a similar paint scheme as I did the door frame. I started with a pewter gray, and I gave it a nice coat. Again, leaving the black slats, that's hard for me to say, leaving those in between. Then I took some granite gray and I gave it a little dry brush. I didn't use the method of picking out different colors, but I think it turned out really cool. Next I grabbed some gunmetal gray and I decided to pick out the topper of the roof. I kind of wanted it to look like they added that later as a weather cap. Now it was time for me to do the door. And as you can see here, because I glued it onto a piece of XPS foam, or actually dollar store foam, there was a little bump that I wanted to actually cut into the chapel. So I took a paper towel and I outlined the layer that I wanted to cut out. And I used that as my base. So when I cut that out of a paper towel, I laid that onto the chapel and I drew a ring around it, and I actually cut out a nice little section of the chapel just to fit the door. And once I got it out, you can see here the door fits absolutely perfectly right in there. Now I turn my sights to the windows. Now I tried to make my own window. Honestly, I tried. Yeah, I tried to cut one out of dollar store foam, and I tried to paint it up with a cute little paint scheme. And it just turned out horrible and comical looking. So I actually took a few windows that John, my brother, had made. And these were actually the reject windows. They had a few bites on them, but I decided to paint them up and see what they'd look like. So I took a little burnt sienna, which has a little reddish color, and I gave them a little kind of a reddish brown wash. I actually soaked them in there, and I included all my little windows as well. And I just dipped them in there and let them soak, and I wanted that that reddish kind of brown to soak in. And then I used my same paint scheme that I used on the chapel, which is raw sienna, some yellow, and a bunch of white. And I made up a little mixture to resemble the sandstone. And hopefully these would have the same kind of sandstone feel as the chapel, but also have a little reddish tint. See that little color that I made up? That's the color you're going for. Kind of a salmon color. And I gave them a little heavy dry brush, keeping the reddish brown lines in between, and I think they came out pretty good. I also painted up my little windows in the same color scheme as well. After I did that, I decided to go back and give them a little layer of pure white, a little dry brush of pure white on the outside, because I think they would stand out a little bit more. So the idea was to make stained glass windows, and I found these nice little barbecue mats, clear barbecue mats at the dollar store, and I traced them out and I started designing my little patterns for stained glass windows. Very easy, just using permanent markers. I drew my pattern and I took various colors and I colored in certain parts, and I just made a little cool stained glass window. It was kind of fun. You can see here they turned out really cool. So once I had those all cut out and ready to go, I grabbed my favorite glue, which is the crafter's pick. And the reason I like this glue is because you can put a little thin layer on one side, and then you put a thin layer on the other side that you're gluing it to, let it dry a little bit, and it's like contact cement. It just immediately bonds. And so there you see I have my nice little stained glass windows. Now, one trick I figured out by accident is if you take some hot glue and make wavy lines on the back side, it actually looks like the ripples in the stained glass window, and it came out really cool. I loved it. So I made little cardboard backings for the windows. Make sure you use the correct side of the cardboard. And I moved on to making the backings for my little tiny windows. And those were just simple cut out pieces of cardboard that I painted black, and I put on the backs of the windows, which ended up looking really neat as if it was dark inside. When I came back the next day, the last thing I wanted to do was I wanted a rope to go from the bell looking like it was in the chapel so somebody could ring the bell. So I took a little crafter's pick glue and I put it on the end of a pencil, and I grabbed my little piece of twine and I stuffed it down in there in the hole so it looks like somebody can actually ring the bell. So there you have it. As you can see, it looks absolutely fantastic. And it looks even better on the table. Look at that. If you guys like what we're doing, please share this video and subscribe and tell all your friends. And please let us know in the comments what you'd like to see us build next, because we're going to keep going. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.